Welcome to You Are From God, where we open the Bible and learn to see the image of God in ourselves and the people around us. I'm Scott Taylor.
And I'm Tyler Hall. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of You Are From God. We're here to talk about our emotions. If you've been paying attention over the last few episodes, you know that we are going through our series here of basic human emotions, talking about how these are God-given and how we need to use them to glorify God and to allow God to help us handle these emotions, and understanding that there's a place where Satan likes to sneak in and try to make our emotions dictate our behavior rather than us choosing how to handle our emotions. So today, Scott, we are going to look at a big one, and it's anger. So certainly when we talk about managing our emotions and talking about how our emotions might get the better of us when we are not paying attention, anger is certainly one that's high up there. If you do a word study of the Bible and just look at how many times anger is mentioned, it's fascinating to understand that by and large, a lot of the times anger is being referred to concerning God's anger. That is the most often it's used. It's talking about the anger of the Lord, or how the anger of God was what motivated certain actions, or his reaction to how people responded to his works or his call or his purposes. And so we have to understand that anger has a place. A holy, righteous, pure, just God has anger, and the Bible is very clear about that. When we take that image of God into ourselves, we have to be sure we're handling anger in an appropriate way. I'm mindful when I talk about this subject of the book of Jonah. We think of Jonah as the prophet who gets swallowed by the fish, and there's this story with this amazing visual. It's helpful for kids. It's helpful for us as we grow older. But in chapter 4, Jonah gets upset that this mission God sends him on actually works. The people of Nineveh repent at his preaching. And so we see in Jonah chapter 4 and verse 1, it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is it not this what I said when I was yet in my country? That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. And in verse 4, the Lord said, Do you do well to be angry? It's amazing to just take this question that God asks, and he asks it again after he kind of makes this display as Jonah waits to see what happens to Nineveh. He makes certain things happen for Jonah, and it brings up his anger again. In verse 9, do you do well to be angry about this plant that I gave you now that it's died? But this question that God asks of Jonah is one we need to be asking ourselves, Scott. Do you do well to be angry? We can be angry and we can acknowledge that feeling. Are we doing well with that anger? And it's just such a powerful thing for me to realize that the things that get me angry, that rub me the wrong way, the things that really frustrate me, a lot of times are very self-centered, are very much based on what I think should happen or my opinions. And I don't do well to be angry. And certainly that's what we see with Jonah here. And that's where we have to put our anger in check.
It's the hardest part, to look in the mirror and actually see what I need to work on, and to understand to the point that you made, there's a purpose for anger. And the danger is that we'll use that anger for things that it's not made for. And certainly Jonah is an example, and we'll look at some others. But the opposite perspective of this is what you said about God. God being angry and it being a righteous reason to be angry. And we certainly see this in Jesus. And in Mark, the 3rd chapter, as an example, he's at the synagogue. It's the Sabbath day. And he knows the situation that's coming up. There's a man there that has a withered hand. And it says that they were watching him closely. And who are they? The Pharisees. So they were there on the Sabbath day at the synagogue for the wrong reason. And so there's no question about that. But they're watching him, and Jesus knows what they're thinking, what they're doing. So in verse 3 he says, And he said to the man with the withered hand, Get up and come forward. And he said to them, Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath, or to do harm, to save a life, or to kill? But they kept silent. And so Jesus knows what they're thinking. He knows their hearts. And then he tells us in verse 5, or we're told in verse 5, after looking around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, he said to this man, Stretch out your hand. And then obviously his hand is restored, and he goes on. And the Pharisees get mad at this. They conspire to kill him with the Herodians. And It's amazing our Savior's reaction to this, though, in verse 5. He was angry. Why? He was grieving at the hardness of their heart. They were missing the point so much. And to your point, they were focused so much on themselves and selfish things rather than truly understanding what really matters. And I think that's important for us when it comes to looking at other people. There's a need for anger. I love that it's coupled here, though, with grief. There's an understanding that there are people that just have hard hearts. There are people that are missing the point of what really matters, to the point that the Herodians and the Pharisees were not friendly to each other. And because of Jesus, they actually become friendly. They're trying to kill him together. And then the amazing story that we all know in John, the 2nd chapter, is where we'll read today, where Jesus goes into the temple and he sees all the money changers and everything that's sitting at their tables, and they're obviously making money selling different things. And in verse 15, talking of Jesus, says, and he made a whip of cords and drove them all out of the temple area with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves, he said, take these things away from here. Stop making my Father's house a place of business. And I love, Tyler, that the anger that we see most often with God in particular is always having to do with the glory of God and something to do with the hearts of man, the selfishness of man, and not really looking at the best interest from a godly perspective and understanding how important that is. The justification in chapter 2 would have been, well, they don't have to carry all the different oxen and animals to sacrifice. They can just get them here. Well, God says, no, that's not what this is supposed to be. This is not a place of business. This is my house. This is my Father's house. And we need to make sure that we have that same kind of anger. It's amazing how often the times we should have anger in various things when it comes to our God and our Father, we don't. And in times where it's really just a selfish anger, we're really good at stepping up and having the anger in those moments. And that's where we need to be really, really careful.
Yeah, and as we move into that, it's fascinating to think about where our anger is directed. There's times when we can get angry with God, and that's certainly something to explore and to think about and to process appropriately. And a lot of times our anger is directed towards other people, whether it's somebody cutting me off in traffic or people I share my house with that, they just get on your nerves sometimes. And that's not a blanket statement. That's just something of, okay, if something's going on and that catches you, you have a choice of how to process those emotions and how to choose to see that person. That's one of the big things with any of these emotions. There's a choice. And you see, even with Jesus here, the anger he has is based on the glory of God and respecting the Father and honoring him as holy. But it's also about caring for the souls of men, seeing the image of God in other people. I think it's fascinating. In verse 16 of John 2, he specifically speaks to those who sold the pigeons. Now, I did some studying for this one, and why does he get on the people with the pigeons? Well, if you look in the Old Testament, pigeons and doves, these are the sacrifices that God permits for the poor. These are the sacrifices if you couldn't afford a lamb or a goat or an ox, you're too poor to have these larger livestock, that God would allow you to make sacrifices with bread sometimes, and then with these small birds. They would be the blood sacrifice that you could bring. And so here he's talking to people that might be trying to take advantage of even the poorest of people coming to worship. And so certainly there's this concern and this anger on the behalf of people disrespecting God, but there's a disrespect for a fellow man. This is not about taking advantage of other people. This is about worshiping God. And I think it's fascinating, and I love the point that Jesus singles out these people that are selling pigeons to direct that to. And it just shows us, again, the motivation. Why is Jesus angry? He cares about God, and he cares about other people. That's when you get into these verses in the New Testament that really focus on there is a time and a place and a way to be angry. We really have to have self-control when it comes to our anger. I know I just said the New Testament, but Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26 is actually quoting from Psalm 4 in verse 4. Psalm 4:4 says, "Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent." Simply this idea, David writing here about how unfair it can be when other men are acting wickedly and getting away with it, so to speak, that can be enough to make us angry. He says you can be angry about things, but you got to make sure that it doesn't slip into the next step of acting out in sin. So there's not a sin to be angry. Certainly Jesus' anger shows us that, but the fact that Psalm 4 says be angry and don't sin makes it really clear that that's a slippery slope if we don't have a check on our anger. Ephesians 4 and verse 26, again quoting this psalm, Paul writes here to the church, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and give no opportunity to the devil." So we see here that anger, when it's left unchecked, when we're stewing on it, when it's building up into wrath or bitterness even, it becomes an opportunity for Satan to wedge us and separate us from God and certainly other people.
And it's the struggle you see with the book of James when you're talking about the anger of man versus the righteousness of God, and really what's the ultimate purpose of the anger that we have. And to your point, Tyler, and it can't be made enough, it's a choice that we have. You can have this emotion come on in a situation, but I choose how I'm going to react to that, or how I'm going to allow that to go forth, if I'm going to have action towards it. And that's what he talks about here in James 1. In verse 19, he says, "You know this, my beloved brothers and sisters, now everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger." Right off the bat, you have the fact and a part that I struggle with anyway, that I need to be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Sometimes it's backwards. We just get angry. We're very happy to let people know what we think instead of just listening and making sure I'm understanding what's going on. In verse 20, though, he says, "For a man's anger does not bring about the righteousness of God." And to your point that you made earlier, this is about intent. What is my purpose or motivation for being angry? Is it because it's something that's going against God and I'm desiring to be pleasing to Him and to glorify Him? Is it because I'm protecting those that are the smallest of us? The Old Testament will talk about the orphans and the widows, and really James will go on and talk about that same thing, that the importance of how we protect those that are helpless in many cases. And are we doing those types of things? Is that what's making us mad? Or is it just the fact that we're just mad and we're just angry? And that anger, to your point in Ephesians 4, we don't just stop and consider why we're angry. We allow it to become action. And that action, when you start letting that out, how many times in my own life there are words that are coming out of my mouth and I want to grab them and pull them back in, but it's too late. I'm already saying something I shouldn't, and it's absolutely not bringing about the righteousness of God. And that's really, as God's children, taking that extra few seconds of thought and really making sure we're listening, and what the purpose and motivation behind what we're about to say, how we're reacting, is so important. But the danger, Tyler, it can be difficult.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to have studies like this, to take some time to see what God says about our anger. I want to go back to Jonah as we close in verse 8 and 9 of chapter 4. I had referenced it earlier, but God asks this question of Jonah again. In verse 9, God said to Jonah, "Do you do well to be angry for the plant?" And he said, "Yes, I do well to be angry enough to die." Even in the stubbornness of talking to God, this prophet is saying, "Yes, I deserve to be angry." And I think I found myself in Jonah's shoes too often, where I double down and I say, I have a right to be angry. And that is a right that I need to let go of a lot more. And because, as God will go on to teach him, in verse 10, "You pitied the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should I not pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle?" That's how the book ends, Scott, and it's powerful to me because it puts the onus, it puts the pressure on Jonah to say, how are you going to be angry? To see this loving compassion from God, and to understand that there is this anger. That's why this judgment was pronounced that Jonah was supposed to go and speak. But when there is the proper outcome, when God is glorified, when people turn to him, that anger melts into this compassion and love. And it is just so important to see that the anger is ultimately producing something. The anger of man, my selfish anger, is not going to produce the righteousness of God, but it is the anger that is focused on godly things. And that we're not just stewing on it, but that we use it, we address it, we feel it, and then we move forward with it. What we do with the next step of our anger really determines how we use this emotion that God has given us, that God shows us that there's a time and a place to be in this emotion. But we can never forget that we are responsible for our emotions and to pursue an anger that is glorifying to God, because each and every one of us is from God. Thanks for listening. Show your support by leaving a review on your podcast app, and share this episode with someone you want to encourage. If you have questions or would like to get in touch with us, go to youarefromgod.com. That's youarefromgod.com.